Today, we're diving into the murky waters of martial arts mythology. You know, those stories and beliefs that get passed around, sometimes sounding so cool you almost want them to be true, but like a perfectly executed fake out, sometimes what you think you know just isn't the reality. We've all heard them, those whispers in the dojo, the dramatic claims in movies. Well, today, we're putting on our myth-busting gloves and we're tackling 5 of the most common martial arts myths head on. We'll dissect the fiction, reveal the facts, and maybe even uncover a little bit of truth hiding underneath. So buckle up because we're about to separate the legendary from the, well, less legendary. Okay, so let's kick things off with a myth that sounds like it belongs in an action movie. The idea that when you earn your black belt, you suddenly have to register yourself as a lethal weapon. Now imagine for a second, you finally achieved this huge milestone in your martial arts journey. Years of sweat, maybe a few bruises, and BAM! The government wants to know if your hands and feet are now legally considered instruments of destruction. It's a pretty dramatic thought, right? So where does this idea even come from? Well, like a lot of these myths, it's probably a mixture of misunderstandings and maybe a little bit of overblown storytelling. The fact is, the idea that highly trained martial artists possess some kind of deadly skill can easily lead to the thought that their limbs should be classified as weapons. Historically, there's some interesting context here. After World War II in Okinawa, which as many of you know is the birthplace of karate, thanks Jesse, the occupying forces did take some measures to keep track of people trained in martial arts. Now this was understandably an effort to prevent any post-war violence. The historical fact might have been twisted and exaggerated over time, contributing to the lethal weapon myth. There's also the possibility of confusion with publicity stunts, like in boxing, where promoters sometimes did things like register the boxer's hands as deadly weapons. These were purely for show, not actual legal requirements, but they could have added to the general confusion. And let's be honest, within some martial arts circles, there's sometimes a tendency to emphasize the power and potential danger of advanced training, which, while not intentionally misleading, could inadvertently fuel this myth.
I suppose we have to register you as a lethal weapon.
But here's the truth of the matter. In the vast majority of places around the world, there is absolutely no legal requirement to register yourself as a lethal weapon simply because you hold a black belt. Legally, a weapon typically refers to objects or instruments, not inherent human skills. However, and this is an important however, your martial arts training can be a factor in legal proceedings. If, unfortunately, a black belt holder uses their skills in an assault, their training might be considered when determining the severity of the offense. Courts might take the view that someone with advanced martial arts training should have a greater awareness of potential consequences of their actions. Now there is one notable exception to this general rule, and that's in Guam. In Guam, they actually have a requirement to register martial arts experts. So it's always important to be aware of the specific laws in your specific area.
See this body? This body is a lethal weapon.
And speaking of legends, if you are as passionate about the martial arts history and spirit of combat as we are, then you absolutely need to check out our exclusive shirt collections. First, our Forefathers collection celebrates 12 iconic grandmasters who shaped the arts we love and wear their legacy with pride. Our Colors of Combat series offers vibrant, abstract interpretations of different martial arts styles. These aren't just shirts, they're a statement of your dedication. Every purchase directly supports this channel, allowing us to bring you more content like this. Head on over to artofonedojo.com and find the perfect way to represent your art and help us continue with sharing the fascinating world of martial arts with you. This myth is one of the most repeated, and it regards the belts that we wear. Specifically, the romantic idea that the black belt originally came from white belts that simply got dirty over time. The story goes something like this. In the early days of karate, a student would start with a pristine white belt. Then, through years and years of intense, rigorous training, this belt would gradually become more and more soiled with sweat, dirt, and general wear and tear of countless hours on the mat. The legend even says that washing the belt was a no-no because you'll be washing away all that hard-earned knowledge and experience. And eventually, what must have been an incredibly long time, the belt would have become so dark that it appeared black, signifying a student's mastery. And the story even sometimes continues, saying that after many, many more years, the belt would start to fray and eventually turn white again, showing that the student had come full circle. It's a really compelling narrative. You know, it totally taps into the idea that true mastery is achieved through relentless dedication and physical exertion. It's a story that emphasizes the value of hard work and passage of time. Plus, early martial arts systems, particularly judo, did start with a simpler belt system, primarily just white and black. This simplicity probably made the dirty white belt story seem a lot more plausible. And let's not forget that in the old days, martial arts traditions were often passed down orally, which, as we know, can sometimes lead to embellishments and changes over time. However, when we look at this practically, the idea of a belt becoming truly and uniformly black just from dirt alone is highly improbable. Fabric and dirt don't always interact that way. A belt will become discolored and worn and maybe even a bit grimy, but not a consistent deep black. And let's be real, hygiene would have been a significant concern. More importantly, the original belt in martial arts was actually black, not white. It is believed that judo founder Jigoro Kano drew inspiration from Japanese swim teams that gave black armbands to swimmers who hit a certain level of proficiency. It is believed that Kano did the same thing with belts, awarding a black belt to students who he felt had reached a certain level. So originally it was just black belt or no belt. The white belt itself actually came later. So while the myth of a white belt turning black is a really cool symbolic story that highlights the dedication and perseverance, it's definitely more of a romantic notion than a historical reality. And since we're talking about Jigoro Kano and the white belt, this next myth actually relates to the legend himself. The myth is that on his deathbed, Kano asked the students to bury him wearing his white belt to symbolize this perpetual state of being a student. It's a beautiful image, isn't it? The idea of such a highly accomplished master wanting to be remembered as someone who is always learning, always humble. It really speaks to the core values that are often emphasized in the martial arts. And the concept of always being a student is definitely a common and respected one within the martial arts community. That's probably a big reason why this story has become so popular. However, the reality of the story is a bit, less romantic. There's simply no solid, verifiable evidence to support this claim. First off, it's important to remember the historical context. Jigoro Kano developed the judo ranking system, and initially it primarily consisted of just white and black belts. All the colored belts that we see today weren't part of the original system. So the significance of the white belt in the way we might understand it now was perhaps a little bit different back then. Furthermore, and this is a pretty significant point, Jigoro Kano did not pass away surrounded by his students. He died in 1938 while on a ship at sea, not in their presence. Secondly, traditional Japanese funeral customs typically involve cremation, and Kano was indeed cremated, not buried. And finally, Kano came from traditional jiu-jitsu background that used a more familial, less formal ranking structure, and technically, he didn't even hold an official Dan ranking within his own system in the way that his students did, so the idea of him having a specific white belt to be buried in becomes even less likely. It's easy to see why a story like this would stick. Jigoro Kano's influence on the martial arts is immense, and the idea of him embodying lifelong learning is certainly fitting within his legacy. But unfortunately, the evidence just isn't there to support the claim that he asked to be buried in a white belt. Okay, this next one is one that we hear ad nauseum, the assertion that 90% of street fights go to the ground. This is a statistic that's been thrown around in martial arts circles, particularly by proponents of ground-based arts like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. The idea is that if the vast majority of fights end up on the ground, then your training should heavily emphasize grappling and ground fighting. So where did this number come from? Well, this statistic is often attributed to Rorion Gracie, a key figure in popularizing BJJ in the late 80s and early 90s. He used this figure to highlight the effectiveness of BJJ in ground fighting scenarios. Now, it's believed that he may have either misinterpreted or perhaps exaggerated information from law enforcement studies at the time. This 90% figure originated from interpretations of studies, particularly those related to the Los Angeles Police Department. Specifically, the work of Sergeant Greg Dossi is frequently cited. His analysis of LAPD use of force incidents provided data on how often encounters ended with officers and subjects on the ground. Now, it's crucial to understand the context of these studies. They primarily focus on situations where officers were attempting to arrest resisting suspects. In those scenarios, it is more likely that physical confrontations would involve grappling and going to the ground, as officers aim to control and restrain individuals to apply handcuffs or regain control. This is a very different situation than a spontaneous street fight between two untrained individuals. And in fact, one study of LAPD use of force showed that the percentage of incidents that resulted in ground fighting was actually closer to 62%. And again, it was in this specific context of law enforcement arrests, not general civilian altercations. Officers are trained in combat and restraint techniques, which frequently involve taking individuals to the ground. Legal considerations also play a role, as officers must use appropriate force, which may sometimes involve ground control. But when we talk about general street fights, the truth is that accurate statistics are incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to obtain. Many altercations go unreported, and what even constitutes a fight can greatly vary. Therefore, that 90% figure is largely unsubstantiated when applied to all street fights. The likelihood of a fight going to the ground depends on a whole range of factors: the individuals involved, their training or lack thereof, their size and intent, the environment, is it the crowded bar, uneven terrain, and the very nature of the conflict itself. Regardless of the actual percentage, the wise approach is to have a well-rounded training that covers both standing and ground fighting. You don't want to be caught in a situation where you're comfortable in only one range. So, while ground fighting is undoubtedly a crucial aspect of self-defense, that whole 90% statistic is a misleading oversimplification and just not quite true. Finally, let's delve into one of the most mysterious and often debated concepts of the martial arts, the Dim Mak, or the death touch.
What the hell is a Dim Mak?
Now, the idea of Dim Mak is deeply rooted in martial arts lore, and it has been heavily romanticized in countless movies and books. The core concept is that a skilled martial artist can target specific pressure points in the body with a subtle touch or strike, causing debilitating injury or even a delayed death. The theory often evolves around the disruption of qi, or vital energy, flowing through the body's meridians, leading to catastrophic consequences hours or even days later. Sounds pretty incredible, doesn't it? The concept of pressure points and meridians does originate from traditional Chinese medicine, particularly acupuncture. Now, while these concepts have a basis in traditional medicine and are used for therapeutic purposes, their application in the dramatic way Dim Mak is often portrayed is greatly exaggerated. Now, it's true that martial arts practitioners throughout history have developed a deep understanding of the vulnerable areas of the human body. Strikes at certain points can indeed cause significant pain, temporary paralysis, unconsciousness, or even death due to physiological trauma. However, the idea of a mystical, delayed death touch that can cause death hours or days later through the manipulation of qi is largely unsubstantiated by modern science. But what made the Dim Mak actually work? It's very possible that some martial artists might have employed hidden techniques or deceptions that contributed to the mystique of the Dim Mak. This could have included the use of, poison needles, small concealed needles tipped with toxins that could inflict subtle but deadly injuries. Now, there might have been deceptive strikes that caused internal injuries that weren't immediately apparent. And let's not forget the power of psychological warfare. The fear and mystery surrounding Dim Mak could have certainly had a psychological impact on opponents. However, modern scientific understanding of physiology simply does not support the idea of a death touch that causes delayed death through the manipulation of some kind of mystical energy flow. The reality is that while the human body does have vulnerable points that can be targeted in combat with significant effect, this is due to the physiological consequences of those strikes, not some kind of mystical energy manipulation. So there you have it, 5 common martial arts myths debunked. It's fascinating to see where these stories come from and why they've persisted for so long. Sometimes the reality is just as interesting as the myth, and understanding the truth behind these beliefs can actually deepen our appreciation for the art and science of the martial arts. So what other martial arts myths have you heard? Let me know in the comments down below, and perhaps we'll do a future video. Now, if you like this myth-busting adventure, I'll throw you in a bonus one. The idea that the Gracies learned grappling from Maeda and then created Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Now, this origin perpetuates some alternative facts and some creative advertising, so let's look at the true origin of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.